The joint declaration signed 3 decades ago sealed Hong Kong's fate.
你睇下嗰個協議嘅內容咧，係應該消除香港人嘅疑慮嘅。
It's not Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. It's designated Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong.
我相信他們會擁護的。
總體上朝着
Going for stability and prosperity, but always with ups and downs, twists and turns.
起伏有波折。
係唔係相信今日所講嘅説話，13年後一樣係照做。
We still enjoy the large degree of freedom, and that our way of life will remain.
咁樣寫落去呢，係應該呢係俾我哋嘅各方面嘅自由啊，同埋我哋嘅權利呢係有足夠嘅保障。
They can promise you all these things, and a few years later they could take everything back.
Good evening. Welcome to the Pearl Report. I'm Diana Lin. In 1984, China and Britain signed a joint declaration to hand Hong Kong's sovereignty back to China and to allow Hong Kong people to rule the former British colony with a high degree of autonomy. This one country, two systems concept was said to be a model to reunify with Taiwan. 30 years on, Taiwan remains intransigent, and mainland China seems to be reneging on its pledges to Hong Kong people. These tree-lined streets in Beijing are the capital's Embassy Row a century ago. The street sign says Hot Road in Austrian. Now it's known as the Taijichang Taotiao. Foreign countries used to be able to station troops and set up banks here like a country within a country. A century later, this became the site of a Sino-British diplomatic battle to retake Hong Kong. In 1983 in Taijichang, China and Britain began talks on Hong Kong's future.
We didn't recognize these unequal treaties. We needed to retake Hong Kong at the right time.
Jonah, now retired, led the Chinese team from the 7th round of talks. He says China began making plans for Hong Kong back in 1972. The first task for China's re-entry into the UN was to wipe Hong Kong and Macau from the colonies list.
Whatever was on the list would gradually become independent. Hong Kong and Macau belonged under Chinese sovereignty. Our stance was recognized by the United Nations, meaning under international law, we'd had a legal basis to take back Hong Kong and Macau.
Seeing Hong Kong's lease was about to expire, Britain looked for ways to prolong its rule. With amicable Sino-British relations at the time, Hong Kong Governor Sir Murray MacLehose in 1978 attended his first Chinese National Day banquet in Hong Kong. The following year, Sir Murray went to Beijing to talk with Deng Xiaoping to test the prospect of extending the new territory's lease beyond 1997. Sir Murray later revealed Deng told investors not to worry, but that was only half of Deng's message. The governor did not say Deng also stated China would retake Hong Kong in 1997.
There was that difference of principle between the two sides.
Alan Paul was a British representative in the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group.
We wanted to see if there was a way in which British administration could continue. The Chinese side were set against that.
Deng Xiaoping first proposed one country, two systems to lure Taiwan. Later, National People's Congress chairman Ye Jianying interpreted it in a 9-point plan, which became a 12-point plan to preserve Hong Kong's capitalist system. But then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher didn't want to hand over Hong Kong.
She said the bottom line with China was to exchange sovereignty for administration.
After winning the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher went to China in September 1982 to meet Deng Xiaoping to discuss Hong Kong's future.
Both sides' stances were established. When Mrs. Thatcher came, she said, "We see your so-called 3 unequal treaties as international treaties. They're valid. You can't repeal them unilaterally. For China to unilaterally announce it's taking back Hong Kong might have disastrous consequences. Deng Xiaoping's answer to these intimidating words was clear-cut. Firstly, the sovereignty question is irreversible and non-negotiable. Come 1997, if the Chinese government hadn't taken back Hong Kong, we wouldn't be worthy of ruling China. We would become the modern-day Li Hongzhang.
That the British government has a clear responsibility for the people of Hong Kong. As leader of that government, what matters to me is that we discharge our moral duty to them.
Exchanging sovereignty for administration gained the support of Hong Kong's mainstream elite. In 1983, lawmaker Alan Lee led a group to Beijing to suggest extending British governance.
So we suggested the sovereignty belonged to China, but lease it to British for the 30 to 50 years until the economic and social conditions and also political conditions are closer.
Martin Lee was in the group.
We pass on the message that the mention of one country, two systems casts a long shadow in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong people are worried about the future.
Because at that time, China's just over Cultural Revolution, not very long. And the people in Hong Kong, majority of them are immigrants, particularly from Shanghai, doesn't have any faith about communist rule at all.
Former head of the Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office, Lu Ping, admitted in his memoirs Hong Kong people worried about Chinese rule. He wrote that Hong Kongers
still wanted the status quo, better not to change. About public opinion in Hong Kong at the time, to say most people positively backed Hong Kong's handover didn't fit the facts. Because in those years, our country had been in terrible chaos. Many people went through various movements. The Cultural Revolution had just passed. People were still afraid. So we never told the central government Hong Kongers supported Hong Kong's handover. We honestly relayed Hong Kongers' concerns.
China rejected the views of Alan Lee's group. The sticking point was sovereignty. Sino-British talks on Hong Kong's future formally began 10 months after Thatcher's Beijing visit. Britain persisted in retaining Hong Kong governance. Being confidential negotiations, Hong Kongers could only get snippets from the media, who in turn had to ambush negotiators on the short walk between the British embassy and residence to garner any news. The public could only infer the progress of the talks from words such as useful and constructive. In subsequent rounds, when even these words vanished, Hong Kong's confidence collapsed. The weekend of the fourth round of talks became known as Black Saturday.
People in Hong Kong know there's a problem with negotiation after the fourth round, and there's no date for the fifth round of negotiations. That is why Hong Kong people start panicking.
China then looked for intermediaries to deliver messages to Britain. Alan Lee was asked to visit Beijing again, but alone and in secret.
The person who invited me, Mr. Tong, is the director in the National Security Bureau. He gave me a very strong message. Deng Xiaoping made the decision already. If the negotiation breaks down, they will announce how to take over Hong Kong unilaterally.
The same message was delivered to London via former British Prime Minister Edward Heath, forcing Thatcher to change her strategy and prepare to retreat from Hong Kong. In January 1984, Thatcher met Hong Kong executive councillors in London and readjusted her negotiation strategies. With no hope of post-1997 governance, Britain shifted its focus. Declassified documents revealed Britain planned to use the 13 years prior to 1997 to build up a constitutional framework for Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong and introduce elections. This was seen as the most effective way to prevent interference in the future Hong Kong SAR. China agreed that Hong Kong's chief executive should be elected or chosen via consultation, but strongly opposed elections for the Legislative Council and for the chief executive to be held accountable to LegCo. So problems persisted. Declassified material also showed only 15 days before the initialing of the joint declaration did the two sides agree to include constitutional reforms, but only in its annex. The final text of the joint declaration was close to Deng Xiaoping's concepts.
I don't think it's right to talk about one side winning or one side losing, but one of the essential points in the negotiation was the enumeration of the principles that Deng Xiaoping had set out, the 12-point plan or whatever. And that did form the nucleus, or part of the nucleus, of the joint declaration agreement as it emerged.
One task has been completed with the signing of the joint declaration. But this is not the end. The agreement on its own can't ensure a successful future for Hong Kong.
Right now, the Beijing government doesn't trust Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. Certain group of people, and neither this group of people trusts Beijing too. But I would say that the major responsibility lies with our leaders in Beijing. They should not screening anybody out. All right? The more you control the Hong Kong people, I tell you, the more Hong Kong people doesn't trust the central government.
Welcome back to the Pearl Report. The Sino-British Joint Declaration provided for a mini-constitution for Hong Kong, but the drafting of the Basic Law was disrupted by a bloody crackdown on pro-democracy student activists in Beijing. June 4th wreaked havoc to preparations for Hong Kong's handover. The shopping hub of Beijing has an affluent capitalistic atmosphere favorably compared with Hong Kong. In the joint declaration, China promised the Basic Law for Hong Kong to legally enshrine what wasn't spelled out in the negotiations. To encourage Hong Kongers to support a Basic Law, prominent pan-democrats were roped into the drafting committee.
If the Basic Law could not enjoy more support from the Hong Kong people than the joint declaration, then they, the Chinese drafters, would consider it to be their failure. That was a very encouraging remark. So I was very happy in working with them.
The Lok Ma Chau border. Martin Lee says he came to inspect it for the first time in the 1980s. He was a Basic Law drafter at the time and a legislative councillor. Today, he sees rapid development in Shenzhen and recalls a speech by Deng Xiaoping.
On an occasion when we were drafting the Basic Law in Beijing, I believe on the 16th of April, 1987, Deng Xiaoping gave us a lecture. He said something very interesting at the time. He said, if 50 years should prove not to be enough for you, we could give you another 50 years. He wanted Hong Kong to remain up high, and China would just catch up. He said, all right, you could have another 50 years, meaning they, the rest of China, would have another 50 years to catch up with us.
But things started changing only 5 years after the signing of the joint declaration.
The final product could have been much better, but for the Tiananmen Square massacre in '89, because there were altogether 3 drafts of the Basic Law. That was a good measure, without which I believe Hong Kong's confidence could have crumbled.
With China's political turmoil, Britain brought Hong Kong's problems to the G7 summit. The leaders there believed international support was crucial to maintain Hong Kong's confidence. The mainland pro-democracy protests of 1989 reawakened Hong Kong people's fear of communism. Martin Lee and 3 other Basic Law drafters quit. The public wanted democratization speeded up with direct elections to LegCo. Alan Lee proposed a numerical consensus. After the June 4th crackdown, the Hong Kong General Chamber of Commerce met with visiting British parliamentarians. Even the relatively conservative Vincent Lo wanted democracy sooner.
喺目前咁嘅情況之下，香港係應該將我哋嗰個民主化嘅係提前嘅。
Along with Democrats and moderates, Vincent Lo devised the 4-4-2 formula, which included increasing directly elected seats in LegCo.
That was after the tragedy of June 4th in Tiananmen. Hong Kong was really devastated. And I guess everybody believed that if we can come up with some form of consensus on our political system going forward, that could instill some confidence in Hong Kong. So everyone was prepared to compromise and agree on a consensus formula. Of course there was pressure because both countries would want their own position preserved. But we just have to do what we believe is best for Hong Kong at that time. That's how I proceeded with that discussion.
确实，国际上有一些人想要把香港成为一个颠覆我们社会主义国家，来攻击我们共产党的领导的这样一个基地。
In the shadow of June 4th, China and Britain restarted negotiations. They agreed to enshrine in the Basic Law a small rise in directly elected seats. Britain sent Chris Patten as Hong Kong's last governor. He unleashed political reforms, becoming democracy incarnate.
Chris Patten was the first to challenge the Sino-British declaration.
Zhou Nan was then the director of the Xinhua News Agency in Hong Kong, the central government's top representative. Chris Patten was accused of 3 violations of the Joint Declaration, of the Basic Law, and of Sino-British diplomatic agreements.
Where in the Basic Law does it tell me what to do about the 9 new functional constituencies?
彭定康先生将来历史上要成为香港的千古罪人。
Sino-British ties collapsed. Zhou Nan resisted even shaking hands with Chris Patten.
Sensitive opportunism. He saw the storm in the British regime. He complained about the Mandarins in the British Foreign Ministry, and even the Thatcher government of being too lenient with the Chinese and conceding too much on Hong Kong's problems. He suffered losses and wanted to counterattack.
Believing that they suffered losses, they wanted to get what they couldn't get from talks 10 years earlier.
Chen Zuo-er was China's representative in the Sino-British Joint Liaison Group. This was where the group had met in Hong Kong. Britain always criticized the group as China's means of an earlier takeover of Hong Kong. About the stationing of troops, the Court of Final Appeal, and Hong Kong's annual budget. The 2 nations were at loggerheads. In his memoirs, Chen Zuo-er described his work as a path bristling with thorns. He criticized the Hong Kong government for increasing social welfare spending.
I said such rapid increase in welfare is planting landmines in the future Hong Kong. If this rapid development persists, it's like a sports car careening along a precipitous road, carrying 6 million Hong Kong citizens, and the driver is you, Chris Patten.
As Sino-British relations deteriorated, China set up a preparatory committee to handle transitional affairs. Rita Fan was in it. She had been an appointed legislator, but quit when Chris Patten came to Hong Kong.
I find that his interest is mostly political. I cannot agree with the way that he seems to indicate how he will deal with China. After the handover, the Western countries have been very interested in Hong Kong's political development. We see that, but as time goes by, a wide spectrum of affairs, the Basic Law was implemented. So at first, the US Congress said that they would want to have a report. And the British government also have this sort of half-yearly report about how Hong Kong is progressing, how the Joint Declaration is being implemented.
Hong Kong people also became increasingly dissatisfied with the Hong Kong and Beijing governments. On July 1st, 2003, 500,000 people marched in protest. In 2006, demonstrators opposed demolishing the landmark Star Ferry Pier. In 2012, mass rallies against a national education school subject. In the past 3 decades since the Joint Declaration was signed, a groundswell of discontent has encompassed all walks of life. As the common values of democracy and freedom take root in Hong Kong, people want more power to decide on their own future.
It's just Hong Kong is totally politicized, and the divisiveness in our community, that's very worrying. And it's not a pleasant environment to live in. There is a lot of discontent, particularly for the young people. We are supposed to be very affluent, but look at the way people are living. They see no future, no prospect for themselves. You know, it's forcing some of the young to become more rebellious.
It's never been easy to find point of balance between these different views. I don't think that is unique to Hong Kong, that if you looked at the political life of any advanced society, anywhere else in the world, you would find that very often there is a polarization, there is a difficulty over achieving a consensus.
Earlier, the central government released a white paper saying one country, two systems should be seen in the context of national security. That sparked worries whether the promised high degree of autonomy is being limited. Rita Fan says Hong Kong is an arena in the contest between China and the West.
The Foreign Affairs Ministry made a public statement that Hong Kong should not be used by external powers to become the bridgehead to cause problem for China or to split up China.
Martin Lee notes the Joint Declaration is registered with the United Nations. Western countries should be concerned about democracy as it's a universal value.
All these governments which supported the one country, two systems and still support it owe to the Hong Kong people at least a moral obligation to speak up on our behalf when something is going wrong.
The Joint Declaration enshrined a framework for Hong Kong, but after 30 years, people are still seeking consensus on the details of one country, two systems.
If with this community split that we see today, it will get worse before it gets better. I think one day our leadership in Beijing said, what the hell is going on in Hong Kong? And if they want to implement the way they think about how Hong Kong should be ruled, and I think we are doomed.
Well, thank you for watching our show. It will be re-aired on Tuesday and Saturday, as well as on tvb.com. Next week, a long disbanded political group personifies Hong Kong's polarized politics. Until then, from the Pearl Report team, good night, good luck, and good health.